hoping for the day that a child will see the light. Feeling alone in the darkness, her heart can hardly bear.
Hello, welcome everyone to Time to Heal. I'm Pam Hemphill and I'll be your host. On this show, I bring you the dark side of addiction to a whole new light by providing you with some hope and solutions to how to stay clean and sober one day at a time. This show is dedicated today to all the mothers who have a child who is still suffering from a drug addiction problem. You may have tried to take them to treatment and maybe treatment failed them. So today we will be discussing issues surrounding treatment programs and how they have changed in the past decade. So my guest today is Don Tennyson, also known as Chicago Don. Don is executive director of Bow Creek in Boise, Idaho. He has worked in the field of addiction treatment for over 35 years, and he's been in recovery himself for 35 years. Don will be sharing with you his knowledge and his personal experience in the field of addiction, with his views on what needs to be changed in the addiction field. So I'd like to start off today by asking Don, what is the biggest drug problem that we're experiencing in society today, and why?
Hands down, opiate problem is the biggest problem in America today. We're talking about prescription drugs like Oxycontin, painkillers. Over-the-counter prescription drugs are the biggest problem. We saw that problem growing many years ago, but often what we do is we'll focus on the current crisis. And so for a few years there, methamphetamine had our attention. If you go back even a few years prior to that, cocaine addiction held our attention for a long time. And so we tend to, at least in the addiction field and in our society, focus our energy on whatever the current drug problem is. What happens, though, is we're not paying attention to the ones that are bubbling up. We're focusing all of our energy, like we did on the methamphetamine crisis in the Idaho area. And what was bubbling up behind that is the opiate prescription drug abuse. And so by the time we realize that the methamphetamine problem's over, we have another crisis on our hands. And that crisis is the opiate crisis. Now understand what happens. Opiates have been around for a long, long time. Back in the day, heroin was a very popular and then became less popular. And I think I shared on one of your shows that when marijuana began becoming more popular and in demand, it actually drove the popularity of heroin, opiates like heroin, into a lower need or a lower demand in our public. Then prescription drugs came about in, say, the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, we've seen a huge spike in the abuse of prescription drugs like Oxycontin. And what happens is that's like a prescription heroin drug. And when you can no longer get the prescription, you'll find yourself on the streets seeking out heroin. Other people will tell you, well, have you tried heroin? And they'll say, no, I would never do that. Well, it's the same thing, the same effect. And so here are people that have never used heroin in their life are now using heroin, sticking a syringe in their arm. And the astonishing part for me is the age difference. We often saw 30, 40-year-old heroin addicts back in the day. It is not uncommon to see heroin addicts under 18 in America today. And that's a huge problem. And it's, as I mentioned before, it's also a huge problem with our society in terms of death and overdose. I mentioned before that heroin overdose has surpassed fatal car accidents in America. Now, just think about that for a minute, Pam. That means that more people in America are dying from accidental overdose. Because I say accidental, because often people who overdose from heroin or other opiates were not planning on overdose. They were, I call it Hollywood suicide or accidental. They took more than they should, and it causes death. That is bigger than car wrecks in America. And I get really concerned that the treatment community is not catching up with that kind of issue or that kind of problem. And so that really concerns me.
You know, and back growing up, I would visualize a heroin addict, and I saw them like a Skid Row alcoholic, poor on Skid Row heroin addict, and they were the bad people. They were because they were stealing and robbing, and doing other things, prostitution, in order to get their drugs. But today, the price of heroin is so low, and is that part of the stigma and the problem why people are trying to ignore that there is a heroin problem because they're still stuck in the past, thinking that a heroin addict is a prostitute or a criminal?
Yes and no. I think some of that behavior still exists. Hardcore heroin users or hardcore opiate addicts understand that you end up taking a pain prescription like Oxycontin. Within 6 months, you're addicted. You need, you're in trouble. And you start using your resources, borrowing, begging, even talking mom, grandmas into loaning you money, and that money goes to the prescription drugs, which are very expensive on the streets. And then you can't get no more money. So boosting, they call it boosting, is where you get items and take it back to the store.
Oh.
And you might go to Macy's and steal something and then go back in there and return it and then use the money for the drugs. Or you might start stealing, or you might start selling drugs, or you might start doing some kind of criminal behavior to get the income to pay for the habit. And so that still exists. What we do have, though, is what you're talking about, is we have upper middle class opiate addicts too. Mm-hmm. These are people that have jobs. It's not uncommon for a doctor or a nurse. It's not unheard of for them to come through one of my treatment facilities for help, because these are professionals that had access to painkillers, picked up a habit, continued, and then got caught. And either are going to lose their license if they don't get treatment and help, and or already lost their license. We see many upper middle class people addicted. We see people who are even seniors addicted. It's not uncommon for me to see a senior come into my facility who started out taking pain medications in a pain clinic and became addicted and began to abuse. And then the physician in the pain clinic says, "I'm done. I'm not going to prescribe to you anymore. You're abusing." Now they go on the streets, or they start selling things to get illegal pain-killing medications from the streets. They sometimes end up in my treatment center or one of the facilities that I work with, begging to help them because they've lost control over their life. These are middle class, senior citizen, professionals, adolescents. No, the faces have changed. Addiction hasn't changed, but the faces have changed.
Thank you. It's really interesting. Another question I have for you. Do you think treatment for addiction is better today than back in the 70s?
I'd have to say yes and no to that. That question conjures up some of my frustrations with modern day treatment. In some areas like Boise, I'm going to pick on Boise a little. Now, this is my home, so I'm picking on my own backyard. I'm probably not going to help my job career in the future by picking on the treatment community. There's the recovering community, and there's the treatment community. In the treatment community, I think in the Boise area and Idaho itself is a little bit behind times, if not a long way behind times, because they don't embrace MAT, medication assisted treatment. I'll give you another example of my concern with treatment today. It is impossible for someone who is addicted to heroin to get help at a methadone clinic in Idaho, and they don't have the resources or the funds to pay for it. Now, if you are addicted to methamphetamine, if you're addicted to alcohol, if you're addicted to other drugs, and you want to seek help and you don't have the funds to pay for that help, you can get funding through the state to pay for your treatment. Here's the biggest problem we have in Idaho is opiate addiction, and Idaho doesn't recognize that these people need treatment if they don't have the funding. They cannot get help. The problem that creates is then the problem grows and grows.
Yes.
You can't get help, so you go back on the streets, and either you're dealing or you're doing criminal behavior, or it just grows, and one addict will infect 10 other addicts in 1 year time. So it's like you 10 times that problem. One person creates 10 more addicts within a year. And so if you have 10,000 addicts times 10, you can see how that problem grows rapidly in our community. Old school treatment, as your question alluded to, I thought was pretty good back in the day. Now, I've been in the treatment field for over 35 years. And back in the old days, we hired recovering people primarily, and they didn't need a lot of education. It was the good old boy that got into recovery that decided to start helping other addicts and alcoholics. And the primary support was 12-step programs. And there was an approach back then that we don't see nowadays, like confrontation. Mm-hmm. Back in the day, confrontation just meant brutal honesty. Your counselor was brutally honest with you. If you were full of poop, your counselor told you you were full of poop. I think we're missing some of that. In fact, what they call best practice approaches today does not embrace confrontation. Confrontation is seen as a more abusive treatment form. And I agree, there are people that should not use confrontation approaches if they don't have the skills. The old idea was you don't tear something down unless you have the skills to build it back up. And so there are people that might confront and do more damage if they don't have the professional skills and or experience to use that type of technique in a way to help. So we've kind of watered down approaches like that. We've kind of made treatment an easier, softer way. And that works for some people. Bottom line is that treatment for addiction is not a specific, in other words, one approach doesn't fit all. And so best practice is good then, because best practice is saying that we have to create treatment plans that are individualized. But that spills over into the regular treatment regime, where then you're trying to create treatment approaches that are not as effective. You have groups that are more didactic in nature than confrontive. So I think there was old school approaches that were very good, and there are new school approaches that have some credibility, but the treatment is watered down a little more. I think that there's a little good from the past, and a little good from the present.
Yeah, I agree with you because I've been trained in motivational interviewing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started too, like you, and 30 years ago, it was a big book, an aid directory, and very little like motivational interviewing or cognitive behavior approaches that we implemented. It was individualized, and the person would ask me what I would suggest that they do, and I would go, "Well, what do you want to do?" It was always put. It was a more of approach like they did in the program.
Mm-hmm.
We can't say you're an alcoholic. We can't label you, but here's the evidence and help you see that. Yeah, you have a problem, and this is what I suggest you do. Also, just to make a little comment on what you shared, the stigma. An alcoholic, we're going to hurry up and rush him. A really chronic alcoholic in the late stages of his disease, and he's having DTs and he's trouble. We're going to take him to the hospital. And the co-founders of the 12-step programs really were into getting them into hospital and getting them the medical treatment. And like you shared, we have the funds for that. We help them. But with the opiate addict, we should be doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. We should be getting them into your type of treatment program ASAP, as soon as possible, and letting the experts like yourself and Dr. Bailey determine, is this appropriate? You're the experts. You're the ones that know that. Not me as a counselor. Even as a counselor, I'm not going to make any legal recommendations or medical recommendations. So, yeah, society needs to wake up and say, hey, let's do funding for treatment, opiate addiction, cocaine, alcohol, and let the experts decide what's appropriate, not us.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's perfect.
There's another little twist that you remind me of too. Is if I'm going to go and I want to become a bodybuilder and I really want to build my muscles, when I go to the gym and I want to find somebody that's going to help me, I'm not going to go to the skinniest guy in the gym. I'm going to go to the guy that has the big guns, and I'm going to say, how do I do that? Well, in best practice or modern day approaches, often you hear in treatment nowadays is there's no support for 12-step programs. They'll hide behind the idea that that is not treatment, that's self-help.
Yes.
And so many treatment centers now avoid involving 12-step programs in their agencies. And I think that's a huge mistake, because if you're treating that individual and then you have 12-step built into the program or as part of the program, and they go to the 12-step program or meetings, they're hearing right from the source, from people they can relate, from people that are going to say things in a way that they can hear. It's like that bodybuilder. If I'm going to get clean and sober, it makes more sense to me to listen to the guy who's been there and has achieved sobriety. And I think that we're hurting treatment a little bit by not doing that and now in today's efforts.
And you're so correct. You're talking about a holistic approach. Trying to make a cake without the eggs is really very difficult.
That's a
So
good way.
you're saying a holistic, that we treat the whole person and make sure all the needs are met.
Exactly.
Spiritual, physical, mental.
Right.
Excellent. And Don, another question. Can you tell us what you mean by your new campaign? Who really has a drug problem?
Well, I gave you a little insight. I'm frustrated with government agencies in Idaho. I'm frustrated with the law enforcement in Idaho, probation and parole in Idaho, drug court in Idaho, because they don't embrace treatment modalities that are proven for years. They have more research behind them than they have behind their modalities. That MAT works, for example, for opiate addicts. You have to understand that there's a train wreck. When you're an alcoholic, you do damage to the brain, and you literally have a car wreck up there. But when you use opiates, you have a train wreck. It's a bigger impact on the central nervous system, and you need medication and the body. One of the reasons opiate addicts use over and over and over is to avoid what they term as dope sick, withdrawal. The withdrawal is terrible, terrible with opiate addicts. I want you to think about the worst flu you've ever had. Just try and conjure up what that felt like when you had it. Withdrawal from opiates is 10 times worse than that. And so you will do anything to avoid that withdrawal. And you'll find ways to use again so you can avoid that withdrawal. You become so sick that you may need medication. You may need a little more help. You know, that old joke that God gave the world 10 commandments, but he gave recovering people 12 steps because he knew we needed a little more.
Yeah.
And well, it's true with opiate addicts. They need a little more. There's a train wreck up here. And medication is a modern day approach that can help stop the withdrawal complications, get them out of that dope sick experience so that the counselor and the treatment people can start working with them. And you use that medication as a tool to help stabilize the patient long enough to get them strong enough, and then you get them off those medications so that they're free, not only from the original addiction, but free from the medications too. What I hear from people in drug court, they're afraid to come to clinics that do methadone or Suboxone because they've heard from the judges, they've heard from the probation officers, they've heard from their counselors that they do not support that type of treatment. So here you are trying to get clean, you have this train wreck, you even with the pressure of the court system, you know, that uses sanctions and incentives, the sanction is that if you don't stay clean, you get locked up. So they create that revolving door syndrome. Or they'll stay clean for a while, but once they have the pressure of the court off them, they relapse. This is a hideous addiction, and it needs support like medication to give them long-term clean and sober time. So I get quite frustrated that if you're looking for help and you don't have the funds to pay for like methadone, you can't get it in Idaho. And then if you're on probation or parole, you get pressure, you get threats from probation officers and parole officers. You don't go there. We don't believe in that. Or if you're in drug court, you don't do that. It's inhumane to make somebody sick purposely. So if you're in drug court and you get arrested and you're in a methadone clinic and now you're arrested, you go through withdrawal again. And the jails, I will give credit where credit's due. The Ada County Jail is pretty good at working with methadone clinics so that if the patient is arrested for whatever reason, that the clinic can bring their medication to them to prevent the withdrawal. But there are some agencies that don't, and they literally cause you to become sick, and that's inhumane to me. So there's many, many frustrations I have with government agencies.
And you know, with smoking, they help us get off nicotine. They give us medicine and pay for it for free. So if they can get that picture that nicotine, opiates are worse than nicotine. Or, well, I've been smoking, I've been off of nicotine now for 4 or 5 months using vaping, and I would not have been able to do it without some help. So
Now, this is another area where I might get in trouble too with your audience, some of them anyway, is that you can't, you know, in the recovery programs we talk about, you can't think your way into a new way of living, you
Right.
have to live your way into a new way of thinking. But if you look at the Department of Corrections or drug court, they use approaches that literally say, if you think like me, you will be okay. And it's not about living differently. It's like you have to think like normal people, whatever that
Right.
is.
Yeah.
And so they have exercises, cognitive behavioral therapy, or similar approaches that are telling the addict that you have to change the way you think. Well, we learned a long time ago you have to change the way you live,
Right.
and the thinking will eventually follow. So I think that's some of my frustrations.
Yeah. Well, with the information that you're providing, hopefully, out there, we're going to be able to make some positive changes to help the opiate addict get some help. Really glad that you came here and shared this with us today. One last question for you. What would you say to a mother out there that has a child who's addicted to opiates and she's tried to get him in treatment before and it hasn't worked? And any other comments you'd like to give to our viewers before we close?
Well, I'm going to use an old school approach, and that's called tough love. We used to teach parents to utilize tough love with addicts, especially in the 80s and in the 90s. And I think that there have been some good that comes out of those approaches. Where I'm at with that concept today is that you can love people the right way and you can love them the wrong way. And what I mean by loving someone the wrong way is by helping them. If you're continually helping them, giving them money, getting them out of trouble, helping them beat a sentence, or to me that's loving them the wrong way. Allowing them to face their own consequences from their own behavior is not that bad of a deal. And we can actually love people the wrong way to the point that they may die by our rescuing and enabling and codependency. So I say, let's love them the right way by saying, I will help you by helping you get into treatment. Treatment works. Sometimes it might be 2 or 3 times in treatment before it works, but you just never know.
Well, thank you, Don, for joining us today. I really enjoyed this with you. It's wonderful information. We'll follow up next week with part 2, featuring Dr. Jeff Hartford. We'll be discussing this in more detail. Thank you for joining me today, and join us on Facebook, Time to Heal, and watch our shows on YouTube. Remember, if you're struggling with addiction, you're not alone. That God can get you through anything. You're never alone. There's always someone out there to help you. Oh, one other quick thing I want to remind you. If you do want to speak with Chicano Don, please call him at 808-419-2142. That's 808-419-2142. And don't give up, because your miracle's on its way.
He knew he could trust her with his child from above. There's no rest for the weary, whereas one crisis follows another. The pain runs deep in the heart of a mother. This nightmare may have made her question her fate, but I have no doubt that in heaven for her, God has a special place. God has a special place